Fixed foveated rendering sounds a bit geeky, don't you think? Well, perfect, because that's the topic for today, guys. First off, welcome back to Sweviver, everyone. I hope you're gonna enjoy this video, as today we're gonna take a first look at fixed foveated rendering in VR. This is a new VR rendering technique implemented in all Pimax wide field of view headsets thanks to the new features in the NVIDIA RTX graphic cards. We will investigate what fixed foveated rendering really does, how it works, or if it really works, and most importantly, how much of performance or extra frame rate can we gain from using it in this early beta stage. But before we start off another geeky journey, big thanks to all my lovely Patreon supporters and a special thanks to my official sponsors on Patreon. Yeah, you know who they are, right? Commander Darklight, Art Armin, and VR Ambassador, of course. If you don't know what fixed foveated rendering even means, don't worry, let me explain it a little bit on the basic level. I won't go deep into the technology behind it, I promise. Fixed foveated rendering, or FFR as I also will call it from now on, is a rendering technique that is mainly aimed for virtual reality and is specifically beneficial when used with wide field of view headsets such as the Pimax 5K Plus, 5K XR or the 8K. FFR is supposed to lower your graphic card's load or overhead by reducing the image quality in zones outside of your direct line of sight, and meanwhile maintaining the same high level of quality in the center part of your line of sight. This basically means a lower resolution is rendered outside of your important viewable area in VR. The results are of course lower requirements and lower load on your GPU in general without compromising the resolution, sharpness and level of detail in the sweet spot center area. What your eyes can see in front of you is basically what you're looking at the majority of time while being in VR. Your peripheral sight or the far left and right sides or edges of the perceived VR image are hardly ever in your eye's focus spot anyway. Just try to focus in real life on anything in your far right or edge sight and you will get my point. It's not only difficult but also quite uncomfortable and unnatural. Well, you may sometimes do it in real life actually, as when sitting on a beach next to your wife and staring at a hot girl to your far right, well, but that's another story. You are indeed constantly using your peripheral vision, both in VR and in real life, but on an indirect and unconscious level. For the majority of time, your peripheral view is mainly there to help you with the increased awareness of your surroundings, your sense of speed and movement, sense of scale, and the overall immersion. Driving a car in VR with wide field of view gives you the proper feeling of velocity or acceleration. Seeing enemy soldiers moving in far left or right side using wide field of view helps you to identify your targets faster without being the target yourself. Having the wide peripheral view also gives you more realistic feeling and actually being inside of that VR world rather than looking through binoculars or a diving mask. I hope this makes sense to you even if you have never tried virtual reality with wide field of view yet. If you ask me, a wider field of view will always be better than a narrow field of view, whatever game or experience you're playing in VR. But the problem with wide field of view is the fact that more of the game needs to be processed and rendered by your GPU and CPU, not only in terms of resolution itself by using larger display panels with more pixels to cover the wider angle, but also because of the wide field of view needs to render in-game objects that would never even be rendered in a narrow field of view headset at the same time, such as more enemies, buildings, trees or any kind of assets within your constant viewable area in VR. Now, here is where the fixed foveated rendering comes into the picture. It will render the game in the max resolution only within your sweet spot area. In the outside parts, it renders the peripheral view in a lower resolution. This can be made in two or several levels with a more decreased resolution the further you go towards the horizontal or vertical edges of the view. I know a proper and more advanced foveated rendering technique could theoretically move your sweet spot view in any direction as you're moving your eyes, but real foveated rendering requires built-in eye tracking, which currently is not available in any consumer-grade VR headset, not today at least. So without any use of eye tracking solution, Pimax has now implemented a fixed foveated rendering option in the software.
But hey, Pimax was not the first. Oculus Go already have this feature.
Sure, but Oculus Go is a narrow field of view headset and basically a standalone unit that doesn't really benefit from the advantages of FFR in the same way. The real advantages of fixed foveated rendering comes when you apply this to a wider field of view, and especially while playing very GPU heavy VR games and simulators. Anyways, the current version of fixed foveated rendering by Pimax is actually still in an early beta phase, so I think we can expect a lot of improvements in the upcoming iterations of the software, but the fact that it's already available makes me quite excited, to be honest. What you need to know though is that the current fixed foveated rendering feature is only available when using a GPU from the NVIDIA RTX series, such as the RTX 2070, 2080 and the 2080 Ti as I have. If you have a GPU from the previous NVIDIA generation such as the 1080 Ti or 1080, this feature won't even be accessible for now. Inside of the Pimax software called PyTool, among many other new features, you can now switch between 3 different fixed foveated rendering modes, even in real time or on the fly while being in the game. The currently available modes are conservative, which means low, balanced, which is equal to medium, and aggressive mode, which is a high level of FFR. The conservative mode will decrease the rendered resolution only in the zone outside of the circular sweet spot center area, approximately above 110 degrees field of view. This mode will only affect the image quality slightly in the peripherals, and I think some people might not even notice the resolution decrease. Also, the affected area here is beyond what any other consumer-grade VR headset can render anyway, right? Going with balanced mode, the resolution decrease is more apparent and reaches a bit further into your main sweet spot area, somewhere above 80 degrees field of view or so, well, based on my own estimations. This mode has a more noticeable decrease in quality and resolution within the affected area, but in most cases still a quite acceptable level without being too distracting. The aggressive mode is the highest level of fixed foveated rendering, where the rendered resolution starts to decrease much further into your sweet spot, only leaving a small fixed area in the center being untouched, basically where your main focus point is most of the time in VR. The example I'm showing you here is the full rendered view from the right eye of the Pimax 5K Plus in normal field of view of around 140 to 150 degrees horizontally. As you may understand, I have added the red circles to give you an idea of the size of the actual untouched sweet spot area with maintained full resolution for each of the 3 modes. By the way, using the wide field of view mode on the Pimax with 160 to 170 degrees horizontally, the untouched FFR areas are actually the same size, as far as I can tell. After all, I'm not a Pimax engineer, so everything I say here is based on my own estimations. It's also difficult for me to measure the number of levels of resolution decrease zones each of the FFR modes have, but I assume that the balanced mode has at least 2 different levels, while the aggressive has 3 levels, as I feel the resolution seems lower and lower the further I look into the peripherals. If you want to check out the fixed foveated rendering resolution decrease more easily, try jumping into SteamVR Home Beta environment, which currently seems to have an issue or bug making the FFR zones to flicker and look more washed out on all the 3 FFR modes. Note that this is a temporary bug that will most likely be fixed by Pimax soon. As you can see, the resolution decrease is easily detectable here whenever FFR mode you're using. At least it's good for demonstration, I guess. Anyways, the higher you go on the FFR modes, the bigger is the area rendered with lower resolution, which in theory should mean that you get a higher performance boost for each mode, right? But is that really the case? Is the current beta version of the Pimax fixed foveated rendering really living up to its promise? Well, let's find out. First, I will give you all my testing results, and then afterwards I will let you know about the possible problems and side effects of using FFR in several scenarios. Upon making the video, I have tested and evaluated a bunch of popular VR games and simulators. Many of these are some of the most GPU demanding VR titles, which are perfect for this purpose. For all of these tests, I've been using my RTX 2080 Ti GPU with the latest NVIDIA drivers version 42531, together with my Intel i9 9900K CPU at 5 GHz on all cores. Also, the latest PyTool beta version was used, version number 121. First off, Skyrim VR. By maxing out the in-game settings and super sampling and also using the wide field of view of Pimax, even the RTX 2080 Ti will struggle in certain areas. Without fixed foveated rendering enabled, the frame rate outside of Whiterun can easily dip below 80 frames per second and sometimes to low 70s or even below. With conservative FFR, the frame rates get much more stable with only occasional dips to mid-80s and most of the time maxing out at 90 frames per second stable. Now that's an increase of more than 10 frames per second in average. Going further with balanced FFR mode, the frame rate is basically stable 90 frames per second, and with aggressive mode I couldn't even see one dropped frame during my test, which makes me believe there's a good headroom for even lower specified GPUs such as the 2080 non-Ti. But I must say though that going higher than conservative FFR is not recommended here, which I will explain later. Fallout 4 VR on the other hand gives us the opposite results actually. As you already know, this game runs like dogshit in VR and basically any GPU and CPU won't help. But funny enough, enabling any of the fixed foveated rendering modes makes the frame rate drop even more, while the CPU frame time spikes through the roof. At first I thought something was wrong here, but after many retries, adjustments and tweaking, I gave up and realized that at this point the Fallout 4 VR engine simply does not benefit from FFR at all. Primordial, a very dark but beautiful VR game, showed a dramatic increase of the frame rate by using fixed foveated rendering. In the first chapter, running upon the first enemies, the frame rate was constantly jumping between low 50s and high 60s, averaging around 65 frames per second without the FFR on. The same scenario with FFR enabled at conservative mode, the frame rate got more stable with an average of above 80 frames per second. Going further with balanced FFR, the frame rate was mostly smooth and above 85 frames per second, and with the aggressive FFR it was more or less smooth 90 frames per second. The game actually looked great even with balanced FFR, while the aggressive mode just killed too much of the details. The next game was The Forest VR, another title being quite heavy on the GPU and not so optimized for VR yet. With some mixed custom settings without fixed foveated rendering enabled, the frame rate was mostly around 60 frames per second or slightly lower. Turning on conservative mode, I got an average FPS boost of maybe 6 or 7 frames per second, and going higher with balanced mode, the increase was around 10 frames per second, but now the image was noticeably more low resolution outside of the sweet spot center area. Aggressive mode gave another boost, being able to run above 70 frames per second quite stable, but the images looked terrible I would say, and I would not go higher than conservative FFR mode playing The Forest VR. The game Hellblade VR gained basically nothing from any of the fixed foveated rendering modes, and the frame rate numbers were in all cases more or less identical to having FFR disabled. The strange thing here is that I could barely see any impact on image quality either, so I assume that the game engine, which is Unreal Engine, just does not allow FFR to work properly yet. Arizona Sunshine on the other hand, the main campaign with the RTX 2080 Ti runs smooth on normal settings and Python at 1.0, but turning up the image quality in-game and also in the Python render quality can really cripple the RTX 2080 Ti. Without FFR enabled, the average frame rate was mostly around 70 frames per second, but already with conservative FFR mode enabled, the game ran smooth at 90 frames per second. Some great results there. Taking it up a notch to balanced or aggressive mode made Arizona Sunshine fully smooth even with lower frame times, but then the game started to look a bit blocky and full of aliasing, so I don't recommend going higher than the lowest FFR mode here. Maxing out the details and using wide field of view in the game Catch and Release, there was a noticeable increase in frame rate turning on the conservative FFR mode. Even if the difference was not dramatic, it still made the game fully smooth, going from an average of 85 frames per second without FFR. Running the fixed foveated rendering in Island 359 or the game Moss, both games being made in Unreal Engine, showed no effect whatsoever in terms of performance, despite the fact that the FFR zones were indeed downsampled by the resolution decrease. In Island 359 there were also some issues where even the center sweet spot area got lower resolution on both eyes, making it look really bad on all three modes. Subnautica gained noticeable framerate boost by having the FFR enabled, at least with balanced and aggressive modes where the average framerate increase was around 10 frames per second, but the game was basically unplayable with FFR enabled because the same problem was apparent as we saw in Island 359, where the center parts of the sweet point view got low resolution and looked really blocky. In Serious Sam 3, fixed foveated rendering has no impact whatsoever besides making the FFR zones lower resolution as intended. The frame rates were identical no matter what mode I was using. The first-person shooter Onward, which is a Unity engine game, should theoretically benefit from the fixed foveated rendering just as some of the other games I just mentioned, but to my big surprise it did not help at all. Onward runs smooth on my RTX 2080 Ti of course, but maxing out the field of view I could easily spot some frame drops in the jungle map, and they did not disappear by enabling any of the fixed foveated rendering modes in Python. Very strange.
But I don't care about casual games, give me VR simulator results.
Alright, let's go with simulators. Unfortunately, this is the part where fixed foveated rendering really doesn't work as expected anymore. In Digital Combat Simulator, the framerate numbers were not affected at all with FFR enabled. The only difference was the CPU frame times got even higher, which is not really a good thing. The image quality was definitely affected by the FFR modes as the peripheral view resolution got lower. I really hope Pimax can do something about this. DCS World or Digital Combat Simulator, being so GPU and CPU demanding, could really benefit a lot from a working fixed foveated rendering solution. And the same goes for IL-2 Stormovik, where the fixed foveated rendering modes does nothing to the performance besides lowering the FFR resolution of course. The simulator runs smoothly on the RTX 2080 Ti, but the frame times were not affected at all, and using higher PyTool values and wider field of view, it made no difference at all with FFR enabled. Also, most of the time this simulator could even crash upon startup when FFR was enabled, so I suspect something is definitely wrong here. Project Cars 2 also did not benefit anything from the FFR modes, and I wonder if the feature even applies to this simulator because I could not see any obvious resolution decrease in the peripheral view even on balanced or aggressive mode. Lastly, I tried Elite Dangerous. Using medium to high settings in the docking tutorial, the performance got significantly better by turning on the fixed foveated rendering already at the lowest conservative FFR mode. Frame rates went from below 70 to stable 90 frames per second. The only problem is that while the right eye view was perfect, the left eye view got a lower resolution in the center part of the view, which made the simulator completely unplayable of course. So for now, FFR cannot be used in Elite Dangerous until Pimax improves this feature for this engine, but there is huge potential here. Looking at the overall mixed results, the fixed foveated rendering implementation might seem quite underwhelming at first. In theory, most of all Unity engine VR games should benefit from this feature, but the majority of the VR games and simulators I tested built on mixed game engines did not benefit from fixed foveated rendering, and while maybe a third of them did actually, there were also individual rendering issues involved in some of the VR titles. I think the main cause for this is the required use of parallel projection in many of these VR titles. This obviously screws up the rendering pipeline when combined with active fixed foveated rendering, which is a shame I think. Also, in some rare cases, the higher FFR modes such as balanced or aggressive can occasionally make some games look more aliased and shimmery outside of the center sweet spot view where the resolution decrease takes place. An example is Skyrim VR, where I highly recommend you to use the built-in temporal anti-aliasing together with FFR if you expect to not see the resolution decrease. And while the aggressive mode might not be so usable and appreciated due to the heavily resolution decrease and because of the very small unaffected center view in the middle, I must say that the conservative and balanced mode are really not decreasing the resolution that much as I expected. And in most cases, the lower resolution outside of the center view is really not distracting to me. Using the conservative mode, it's sometimes even hard to tell that the peripheral view resolution is decreased at all. In the end, when the fixed foveated rendering obviously makes an impact in a game, giving you a good boost in frame rate just by enabling it, the performance difference between the lowest conservative mode and the highest aggressive mode is actually pretty small. So for now, I cannot really see the real reason to use aggressive mode at all, maybe not even the balance mode either. The conservative mode gives a good enough boost already, and the technology itself is very promising indeed. This might be a part of the VR future, especially paired with future eye tracking modules in Pimax VR headsets for more dynamic foveated rendering and not only fixed. Lastly, as I said before, this is only the first beta version of the FFR from Pimax, and I'm pretty sure this feature will improve a lot in the upcoming updates, so I wouldn't worry too much about the currently not supported or unaffected VR games and simulators. Because when FFR really works, it's actually quite a nice feature, giving a significant performance boost with sometimes more than 25 or even up to 40% of increase of frame rate numbers, which is quite impressive to me, don't you think? It's basically an early proof of concept which can only improve over time, and believe it or not, Pimax is the first brand introducing this into PC VR gaming, where the performance is needed the most. Are you surprised? Well, I'm not. And guys, what do you think about the fixed foveated rendering mode introduced with Pimax headsets? Please let me know your thoughts in the comments down here below. Big thanks for watching everyone, please subscribe to my channel and stay tuned for an exciting spring with new videos coming up here on Sweviver. And of course, a big thanks to all my Patreon supporters, and a special thanks to Commander Darklight, Art Armin and VR Ambassador, my official sponsors on Patreon. See ya guys!